May 21st, 1944. 6,000 feet above the forests of northern France, Captain Robert Sanders adjusted his throttle and scanned the rail line below. His P-47 Thunderbolt, 7.5 tons of radial engine and armor plating, banked through the morning haze as he searched for targets that would change how America fought its war. The radio crackled with operations control, confirming what intelligence had suspected for weeks. German rail traffic had tripled since April. Every locomotive steaming toward Normandy carried ammunition, reinforcements, or the heavy equipment that would slaughter Allied soldiers when they hit the beaches in 2 weeks. Sanders had spent 18 months flying high-altitude bomber escort missions, watching B-17 seconds release their payloads from 20,000 feet, while German trains continued rolling with impunity. The mathematics were brutally simple. High-altitude bombing achieved less than 2% accuracy against moving targets. Bombs tumbled through miles of air, scattering across countryside while locomotives maintained their schedules with mechanical indifference. The German rail network that sustained Hitler's Atlantic Wall remained essentially untouched, despite months of strategic bombing. But on this morning, Sanders carried new orders that violated every principle of aerial combat he had learned since flight school. Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo. The code name sounded whimsical, almost frivolous, until you understood what it demanded. 800 Allied fighters would descend to treetop level and systematically destroy every locomotive, every railcar, every piece of rolling stock within 500 miles of the invasion beaches. No high-altitude bombing runs, no careful formation flying at safe altitudes. Just raw, unfiltered violence delivered at speeds that left no room for error and altitudes that turned every German with a rifle into a legitimate threat. The briefing at East Wretham had been characteristically direct. Major Glenn Duncan, the lanky Texan who pioneered low-level P-47 tactics, stood before assembled pilots with the conviction of someone who had already proven the impossible. Gentlemen, strategic bombing isn't winning this war fast enough. We're dropping thousands of tons of ordnance and the Germans keep moving trains. They know we can't hit them from altitude. They've calculated our bombing patterns, timed their movements, and accepted a 2% loss rate as the cost of doing business. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Duncan's hand swept across the tactical map, tracing rail lines that threaded through France like arteries feeding a dying empire. But what happens when we come in at 50 feet? What happens when we're on top of them before their flak guns can depress? What happens when locomotive engineers look up and see 8.50 caliber machine guns bearing down on their cab? Captain Harold Comstock, a veteran of 43 bomber escort missions, raised the question every pilot was thinking. Sir, at 50 feet we're flying straight into concentrated ground fire. Every German soldier with a rifle becomes a threat. One lucky shot to the oil cooler, one 20mm round through the engine, and we're dead before we can gain altitude for bailout. Duncan's expression carried the weight of calculated risk that defined innovation in warfare. You're right, this is more dangerous than anything we've flown before. But consider the alternative. Intelligence estimates the Germans can move 15 divisions by rail in the 2 weeks before D-Day. 15 divisions. That's 200,000 combat troops who will be dug in and waiting when our boys hit the beaches. How many Allied lives is it worth to stop those trains? The silence stretched as pilots processed the mathematics of survival. Every man in the briefing room understood the equation. Risk their lives now in low-level attacks, or watch infantry friends die by the thousands, assaulting fortified positions that could have been isolated if German rail transport had been eliminated. The choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between different categories of death, different calculations of whose blood would water French soil. Lieutenant James Mitchell broke the tension with the pragmatic question that would determine tactical success. What's our ordnance load? Duncan's smile suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask about the technical details that transformed theory into operational reality. Standard load. 8.50 caliber machine guns with 2,700 rounds total. 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs on wing pylons. High-velocity aircraft rockets for hardened targets. The P-47 carries more firepower than any fighter in theatre. We're going to use every ounce of it. The tactical briefing lasted 3 hours, covering every aspect of an operation that would rewrite doctrine on air-ground warfare. Pilots studied reconnaissance photographs showing German locomotives with their vulnerable points highlighted, boiler casings that ruptured under sustained .50 caliber fire, fuel tenders that exploded when hit with rockets, the mechanical weak points that transformed trains from mobile fortresses into stationary coffins. But the photographs couldn't capture the human reality of what low-level strafing demanded. Flying at 50 feet meant navigating by visual reference with no margin for instrument failure. At 350 miles per hour, pilots covered 500 feet per second, leaving fractions of seconds to identify targets, line up gun sights, and pull away before slamming into the terrain they were supposed to be destroying. One moment of distraction, one misread altimeter, one mistimed pull-up, and 7.5 tons of aircraft became a crater in French farmland. The weather forecast for May 21st promised clear skies and unlimited visibility across northern France. Perfect conditions for the systematic destruction of German rail capacity. Intelligence had identified 3 primary target zones. The rail corridor between Paris and Le Havre that supplied the Atlantic wall defences. The marshalling yards at Amiens where German divisions staged for deployment to Normandy. The junction points at Abbeville where supplies from the Ruhr industrial region transferred to local lines feeding coastal positions. Each target zone represented months of German logistical planning, thousands of tons of military equipment, and the combat effectiveness of divisions that would determine whether D-Day succeeded or failed. Captain Sanders understood the strategic importance with crystalline clarity. Every locomotive destroyed meant ammunition that never reached coastal batteries. Every railcar eliminated meant reinforcements that never arrived to, counterattack Allied beachheads. Every bridge dropped meant supply lines severed and German units fighting with whatever they carried in their packs. The mission briefing concluded with Duncan's final reminder of why conventional warfare had failed to solve the rail interdiction problem. For 2 years we've been fighting the way the manual says to fight. High altitude, formation flying, coordinated bomb runs against fixed targets. The Germans adapted. They moved trains at night. They dispersed rolling stock across hundreds of small yards. They calculated our bombing accuracy and accepted losses as inevitable friction of logistics. Duncan's voice carried an edge that suggested personal investment beyond professional duty. But they never calculated for this. They never planned for fighters attacking from treetop level at maximum speed. They never trained their flak crews for targets appearing and disappearing in seconds. They never imagined American pilots would trade altitude, advantage for the raw violence of close-range strafing. The assembled pilots absorbed the message, with the quiet recognition that they were about to participate in something unprecedented. Low-level ground attack wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't a training exercise or a limited raid against isolated targets. Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo represented the systematic application of a new doctrine that would either revolutionize air warfare or kill everyone involved in the experiment. Pre-dawn on May 21st found Sanders performing his walk-around inspection of P-47 No. 4-2-27221, the aircraft that would carry him into combat for the 44th time. The Thunderbolt sat on the tarmac like a mechanical bull, its massive Pratt & Whitney R. 2,800 radial engine dominating the forward fuselage. Ground crews had loaded 2 500-pound bombs on the wing pylons, checked the functionality of 850 caliber machine guns, and topped off fuel. Tanks that would give Sanders 90 minutes of combat operations before he needed to think about returning to base. The crew chief, Sergeant Thomas Walsh, a Philadelphia native who had maintained Sanders' aircraft through 18 months of combat operations, performed the final checks with ritual precision. Oil pressure nominal, sir. All gun systems tested and operational. Bombs fused for ground detonation. Radio frequencies preset for mission coordination. She's ready to go hunting. Sanders nodded his appreciation for the professional competence that kept pilots alive through hundreds of combat sorties. Walsh and his maintenance crew worked 16-hour days in conditions that ranged from freezing rain to summer heat, maintaining aircraft that absorbed punishment no peacetime engineer had imagined possible. Bullet holes patched, flak damage repaired, engines rebuilt after pushing past rated limits, all performed with the understanding that sloppy maintenance killed pilots as surely as German fighters. The walk to his aircraft gave Sanders time to process the reality of what the mission demanded. He had flown enough combat to understand the difference between necessary risk and suicidal stupidity. High-altitude bomber escort involved danger from German fighters and flak, but altitude provided options. Room to maneuver, time to assess damage, altitude to trade for airspeed if engines failed. But low-level strafing eliminated every safety margin that kept pilots alive. One mistake, one malfunction, one lucky enemy shot, and there was no altitude to bail out, no time to assess options, no margin for error of any kind. The engine start sequence followed muscle memory developed through hundreds of repetitions. Mixture rich, throttle cracked, magnetos on. The R-2800 coughed twice before catching with a thunderous roar that sent vibrations through the entire airframe. Sanders watched oil pressure climb into the green as the massive engine settled into its characteristic rumble, 18 cylinders producing 2,000 horsepower, turning a 13-foot propeller that could pull the 7.5-ton fighter through the air at 430 miles per hour when conditions demanded maximum performance. The radio crackled with tower clearance for taxi and takeoff. East Rhythm control to Mustang flight. You are cleared for departure runway 27. Weather is clear. Winds 5 knots from the northwest. Visibility unlimited. Good hunting, gentlemen. Sanders acknowledged and released the brakes, guiding the P-47 along the taxiway with the careful attention required by the fighter's terrible ground visibility. The massive nose blocked forward view completely, forcing pilots to S-turn while taxiing to see where they were heading. The landing gear, designed to absorb the punishment of carrier operations, even though the P-47 never flew from carriers, gave the aircraft a tail-high attitude that made taxiing feel like steering a truck from the back seat. The takeoff roll consumed 3,500 feet of runway as Sanders advanced the throttle to full power and felt the acceleration press him into the seat. The tail came up at 80 miles per hour. The main gear broke contact at 110, and suddenly he was airborne, climbing into the morning sky with 750 pounds of ordnance and 2,700 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Everything he needed to kill locomotives and the infrastructure that kept them running. The mission flight plan called for a low-level approach to the target area, maintaining 50 feet altitude from the English Channel to the first rail junction near Abbeville. Intelligence had confirmed German radar couldn't track aircraft flying below 200 feet due to ground clutter effects. By staying low, the attacking fighters would arrive unannounced, giving locomotive engineers and flak crews no warning until P-47 seconds appeared over the horizon already, firing. Sanders formed up with his flight of 4 Thunderbolts, checking, spacing, and confirming radio frequencies. The formation tactics for low-level attack differed fundamentally from high-altitude escort missions. No tight formations to present concentrated firepower. No assigned positions to maintain through evasive maneuvers. Instead, the flights would operate independently, attacking targets of opportunity with the understanding that coordination came from shared objectives rather than rigid adherence to formation discipline. The French coastline appeared as a dark line against the blue-grey waters of the English Channel. Sanders descended to 50 feet, feeling the strange sensation of flying with the altimeter needle touching the bottom of its scale. At this altitude, the ocean surface rushed past with hypnotic speed, providing visceral feedback about velocity that high-altitude flying never captured. 350 miles per hour, translated to 512 feet per second, turning the world into a blur of motion that demanded absolute concentration on flying while simultaneously searching for targets and monitoring instruments. The French coast slipped beneath his wings at 0621 hours. Sanders pulled back slightly to clear the beach obstacles, then descended again to hug the rolling farmland of northern France. The morning sun cast long shadows across fields that would soon become battlefields. Small villages scattered across the landscape, their inhabitants still sleeping, unaware that American fighters were racing overhead at altitudes that made the Thunderbolt's engine roar feel like physical pressure against eardrums. The first locomotive appeared at 0629 hours, a dark plume of smoke rising from a rail line that threaded through a shallow valley 3 miles ahead. Sanders keyed his radio with practiced economy. Mustang leader to flight. Target bearing 045, range 3 miles. Single locomotive with approximately 15 cars, setting up for attack run. His wingman, Lieutenant David Chen, acknowledged immediately. The attack profile called for a diving approach from 2,000 feet, allowing pilots to identify the target, assess defenses, and set up gun runs before committing to the final phase, where breaking off became impossible. Sanders climbed, keeping the locomotive in sight as he calculated angles, speeds, and timing. The German train crew had spotted the American fighters and begun evasive procedures, increasing speed in a futile attempt to reach the tunnel entrance visible a mile ahead. The locomotive belched black smoke as the engineer opened the throttle, pushing the wartime Kriegslocomotive to its maximum speed of 50 miles per hour. Sanders armed his guns and selected bombs for release. The P-47's gun sight projected onto the windscreen, providing a targeting reference point that experience had taught him to use more as suggestion than absolute guide. At low altitude with rapidly changing angles, accurate shooting demanded instinct more than mechanical calculation. Point the nose where you want bullets to go, hold the trigger until the target disintegrates, break away before you fly through your own debris field. The locomotive grew in his windscreen as Sanders pushed the nose down, establishing the shallow dive that would bring him to 50 feet altitude directly behind the train. His thumb found the trigger on the control stick. His index finger rested on the bomb release, everything happening simultaneously, 8 guns firing, bombs releasing, aircraft pulling up through the fireball of exploding ordnance, all compressed into 10 seconds of violence that would determine whether this locomotive continued rolling or became scrap metal blocking German supply lines. The 50 caliber machine guns opened fire at 800 yards, their combined firepower throwing 5,000 rounds per minute downrange. Tracer rounds marked the path as bullets walked across the locomotive's tender, tearing through steel plating like tissue paper. The boiler casing, designed to contain steam at 250 pounds per square inch, ruptured under the concentrated fire. Superheated steam exploded outward, enveloping the locomotive in a white cloud that turned instantly into a scalding death trap for the engine crew. Sanders released both bombs at 400 yards, watching them tumble forward as he pulled up sharply. The delayed fuses allowed 3 seconds before detonation, long enough for Sanders to clear the blast radius but close enough that the shockwave lifted his P-47 like a toy in a hurricane. He fought the controls, maintaining positive altitude as fragments of destroyed railcar rained down across French farmland. Lieutenant Chen followed 15 seconds behind, his guns raking the surviving railcars while Sanders circled to assess damage. The locomotive lay on its side, boiler torn open, wheels spinning, uselessly as escaping steam created a geyser visible for miles. 5 railcars had derailed in the explosion, their cargo of military equipment scattered across the trackbed. The remaining cars sat intact but isolated, unable to continue without motive power. The radio crackled with reports from across the target area. Mustang 3 destroyed locomotive at grid reference 4278, approximately 20 rail cars disabled. Mustang 4 engaging locomotive near Amiens marshalling yard. Heavy flak, 1 direct hit observed. Sanders checked his fuel and ammunition status. 2 bombs expended, approximately 1,800 rounds remaining. Fuel consumption normal. Time on target, 8 minutes. He still had 82 minutes of combat operations before fuel concerns forced a return to base. The morning sky over northern France filled with black smoke from burning locomotives and the occasional bright flash of exploding ammunition cars. Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo was transforming German logistics from mechanical efficiency into scattered chaos, 1 destroyed train at a time. But the cost of this innovation was becoming apparent as pilots reported damage, casualties, and the brutal reality of low-level combat where there was no room for error and no altitude for second chances. The second wave of attacks commenced at 0715 hours, as 350 P-51 Mustangs from the 8th Air Force crossed into German airspace, their mission identical to the P-47 operations in France. Destroy every locomotive, eliminate every railcar, sever every supply line that fed Hitler's war machine. The operational reports streaming back to command centers documented systematic destruction that exceeded even the most optimistic planning estimates. By 0800 hours, reconnaissance flights confirmed 107 locomotives destroyed across the target zones. Not damaged, not disabled, completely destroyed. Boilers ruptured. Fuel tenders exploded. Driving wheels twisted into scrap metal by bombs that hit with surgical precision. The German rail network that had moved 15 divisions in March was hemorrhaging transport capacity at rates that made replacement impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Douglas, operations officer for the 359th Fighter Group, monitored radio traffic from his command post at East Reetham with growing recognition that they were witnessing doctrinal transformation in real time. Every report confirmed what high-altitude bombing had failed to achieve in 2 years of strategic operations. Low-level attacks worked, not theoretically, not under ideal conditions, but consistently, repeatedly, devastatingly. His status board tracked aircraft, ammunition expenditure, and confirmed kills with the methodical precision that separated professional military operations from random violence. 387 locomotives reported destroyed or disabled by 1100 hours. 1,243 railcars confirmed, eliminated. 86 bridges dropped across critical junctions. The mathematics told a story that German logistics officers would spend the next 2 weeks desperately trying to solve. The German response revealed the depth of their strategic miscalculation. Oberst Heinrich Brenner, Chief of Rail Operations for Wehrmacht Transportation Command, received the first damage reports at his headquarters in Paris with the dawning horror of someone watching carefully constructed plans disintegrate. His staff had calculated acceptable loss rates based on 2 years of high-altitude bombing data. 2% locomotive losses per month, 5% railcar attrition, damage rates that German repair capacity could absorb indefinitely. But the reports flooding his operations center described something fundamentally different. Entire marshalling yards burning. Locomotive repair facilities destroyed by fighter bombers that appeared without warning and departed before flak guns could engage, effectively. The American attacks weren't creating manageable damage that German engineering could repair. They were eliminating transport capacity faster than replacement locomotives could be manufactured. Brenner's morning briefing to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, laid out the crisis with clinical precision. Herr Feldmarschall, we have lost operational control of the rail network in the invasion threat zone. As of 0900 hours, 231 locomotives confirmed destroyed, 419 more damaged beyond immediate repair. Rail traffic in northern France has dropped to 38% of February levels. Von Rundstedt studied the tactical maps with the expression of someone watching strategic assumptions collapse in real time. His defensive plans for repelling an Allied invasion depended absolutely on rapid rail movement of armoured divisions from interior positions to threatened beaches. The German army couldn't match Allied naval supremacy or air superiority, but it possessed mobile armoured reserves that could crush any beachhead if they arrived quickly enough. Those reserves moved by rail. There was no alternative. German truck transport lacked the capacity to move division-strength units hundreds of miles. Only trains could deliver the combat power needed to throw the Allies back into the English Channel. Brenner continued with the assessment that would define German defensive capabilities for the next critical month. Even with emergency repair protocols and civilian labour requisition, we cannot restore full rail capacity before early June. The American attacks are continuing. They're hitting repair facilities, spare locomotives, even individual trains moving at night. Every locomotive we lose now represents combat power that won't reach the invasion beaches. The second call to action in the script placed at approximately 2,900 words. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The systematic nature of American operations became apparent as the day progressed. This wasn't random interdiction or opportunistic target selection. Allied intelligence had identified every critical rail junction, every marshalling yard, every locomotive depot within striking distance of the Normandy beaches. The attacks followed a choreographed pattern that revealed months of planning. First wave fighters destroyed locomotives at forward positions. Second wave attacked repair facilities to prevent recovery. Third wave hit marshalling yards, where replacement equipment staged for deployment. Captain Sanders completed his third attack run at 1,045 hours, his ammunition nearly exhausted and fuel gauge dropping toward the reserve threshold that mandated return to base. His gun camera footage would document 6 locomotives destroyed, 4 rail cars exploded, and 1 bridge damaged badly enough to require weeks of repair work. Statistics that translated into German divisions stuck in place while Allied armies established beachheads and began the long push toward Berlin. The flight back to East Wreatham provided time for Sanders to process what he had experienced during 5 hours of continuous combat operations. The low-level attacks demanded concentration that left no mental bandwidth for fear or reflection. Point the nose at the target, fire the guns, release the bombs. Pull up before you hit the ground, or fly through your own explosion. Repeat until ammunition exhausted or aircraft damaged beyond safe operation. The mechanical nature of the mission created psychological distance from the human implications of what they were destroying. But the implications were inescapable. Every locomotive Sanders destroyed meant German reinforcements that never reached their destination. Every railcar eliminated meant ammunition that never supplied coastal batteries. Every bridge dropped meant supply lines severed and enemy units fighting with reduced combat effectiveness. The strategic impact of tactical actions played out across scales that individual pilots could influence but never fully comprehend. The debriefing at East Wreatham documented lessons that would reshape American air doctrine for the remainder of the war. Major Glenn Duncan synthesized pilot reports with the analytical precision that had made him the architect of low-level tactics. Gentlemen, we've just proven that fighter bombers can achieve what strategic bombing couldn't. In 6 hours, we eliminated more German transport capacity than 6 months of high-altitude operations. The question now is how we systematize this success and apply it across every theater where rail interdiction matters. The casualty reports tempered celebration of tactical success with sober recognition of the costs that innovation demanded. 13 aircraft lost to ground fire, 9 pilots killed in action. 4 successfully bailed out and evaded capture through French resistance networks. The loss rate of approximately 3% represented acceptable attrition for the level of destruction achieved, but each statistic translated into empty chairs in squadron ready rooms and notification telegrams that would devastate families back home. Lieutenant James Mitchell died when his P-47 took a direct hit from 20mm flak while pulling up from a strafing run near Abbeville. The shell penetrated the cockpit, killing him instantly and sending 7.5 tons of fighter into a rolling dive that ended in a fireball visible for 15 miles. His wingman, Lieutenant Robert Tanner, transmitted the terse combat report that documented another price paid for tactical advantage. Mustang 4 is down. No shoot observed. Position approximately 10 miles northeast of target zone. Captain Harold Comstock survived a catastrophic engine failure at 50 feet altitude through a combination of skill and desperate luck that defied statistical probability. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 quit without warning as he lined up for a strafing run, transforming 7.5 tons of fighter into a gliding brick with approximately 3 seconds to find a landing site. Comstock pulled back on the stick, trading airspeed for altitude and buying himself precious seconds to scan the landscape rushing past at 300 miles per hour. A farm field appeared dead ahead, freshly ploughed and mercifully flat. Comstock dropped the landing gear, prayed the hydraulics would function without engine power, and held the nose high as the P-47 settled toward the ground at twice the normal landing speed. The impact collapsed the nose gear and sent the fighter sliding across French farmland in a spray of dirt and torn metal. Comstock, unstrapped, kicked open the canopy and ran from the wreckage, expecting explosion or fire or German soldiers. Instead, he found a French farmer who spoke no English but understood immediately that the American pilot needed to disappear before German search parties arrived. The resistance network that spirited Comstock back to England 3 weeks later represented another dimension of the campaign against German logistics. French railway workers had been sabotaging trains since 1941, their intimate knowledge of the system allowing precise attacks that complemented Allied air operations. A few well-placed explosives in a locomotive boiler, a damaged switch that sent trains into sidings rather than main lines, critical intelligence about German rail schedules transmitted to London for targeting by Allied fighters. The combination of air attack and ground sabotage created cascading failures that German logistics couldn't absorb. Intelligence Officer Major Thomas Bradford synthesized the damage assessment reports with professional satisfaction. The transportation plan is working beyond projections. German rail traffic has dropped to 10% of pre-attack levels in the target zone. They're moving supplies by truck convoy, which makes them vulnerable to continuous air attack. They're attempting night rail operations, but we're flying missions around the clock now. The Germans can't move divisions fast enough to matter. The operational statistics documented transformation of warfare that would influence military doctrine for generations. Between May 21st and June 6, 1944, Allied fighters destroyed 475 locomotives across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. Not the inflated claims that often characterized combat reports, but confirmed kills, verified by reconnaissance photography and intelligence intercepts. 475 locomotives eliminated in 2 weeks through tactics that conventional wisdom insisted were suicidal. The impact cascaded through every level of German defensive planning. Armoured divisions that should have reached Normandy in 36 hours took 5 days, or never arrived at all. Artillery units that depended on rail transport for ammunition supply found themselves rationed to 10 shells per gun per day. Infantry reinforcements marched hundreds of miles on foot because no trains were running, arriving exhausted and combat ineffective at precisely the moment when Allied armies needed to be thrown back into the ocean. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B and the officer responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall, expressed his frustration in reports to Hitler that read like obituaries for German strategic planning. The enemy's air superiority has made rail movement impossible during daylight hours. Night operations achieve limited success but cannot move the volume of men and material needed for effective counterattack. We are defending the most important coastline in Europe with forces that cannot be reinforced or adequately supplied. The German High Command's response revealed how completely American innovation had shattered their operational assumptions. Orders went out to disperse locomotive repair facilities, hide rolling stock in tunnels during daylight hours, and mount anti-aircraft guns on every train that moved. But these countermeasures addressed yesterday's threat, while American fighters adapted to each defensive innovation with tactical flexibility that German rigid doctrine couldn't match. Captain Sanders flew his 52nd and final mission on June 4, 1944, 2 days before Allied armies would land on beaches that German reinforcements should have reached but couldn't because their trains never arrived. His target was a locomotive depot near Rouen, where German engineers had concentrated repair operations after dispersal proved ineffective. The attack followed established patterns. Dive from 2,000 feet. Strafe the locomotive works with 8 50 caliber machine guns. Release bombs against repair sheds. Pull away through defensive fire while wingmen covered the escape. But this mission ended differently when a 20mm shell from a railway flak car caught Sanders' P-47 inches the wing route, severing hydraulic lines and puncturing the main fuel tank. The Thunderbolt's legendary durability kept it flying long enough for Sanders to nurse the damaged fighter back across the English Channel, but the emergency landing at the first available airfield marked the end of his combat tour. 18 months of operations, 52 missions, 14 confirmed locomotive kills personally attributed to his marksmanship. The statistical summary of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo would fill after-action reports and strategic assessments for years after the war ended. But the human reality played out in scattered moments across northern France during those 2 weeks in May. Locomotive engineers watching American fighters appear on the horizon and knowing they had seconds to live. German soldiers stuck at rail stations watching trains that would never arrive. French resistance fighters sabotaging switches, while Allied bombers destroyed the infrastructure their sabotage had identified as critical. And in squadron ready rooms across England, pilots processed the recognition that they had just rewritten the manual on air-ground warfare through tactics that demanded innovation, courage, and willingness to challenge every assumption about how fighters should operate. The cost had been real. 37 pilots killed during the 2-week campaign, 51 aircraft destroyed, losses that devastated squadrons and shattered friendships forged through months of shared combat. But the alternative cost would have been measured in thousands of Allied infantry casualties assaulting beaches defended by German divisions that rail transport should have delivered but didn't. The mathematics of warfare came down to brutal equations about whose blood would be spilled and where. Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo had determined that German logistics officers would pay the price of American tactical innovation. The morning of June 6, 1944, Allied armies hit the Normandy beaches against resistance that historians would later characterize as surprisingly light given German defensive preparations. The surprise wasn't tactical or operational. German intelligence had identified Normandy as a probable landing site, but the German army couldn't mass the defensive forces needed to throw the Allies back because their transport network had been systematically destroyed by fighter bombers flying at altitudes that made them impossible to stop. Eisenhower's decision to attack French railways before D-Day had sparked intense debate among Allied leadership. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill worried about French civilian casualties from bombing campaigns that would inevitably kill innocents. Strategic bombing advocates argued that diverting fighters from German industrial targets would prolong the war. Political considerations about post-war relations with France complicated every targeting decision, but the results justified every controversial choice. German rail traffic in northern France on June 6 stood at 10% of January levels. The Wehrmacht possessed armoured divisions capable of crushing the Allied beachhead if they could reach Normandy quickly enough. But those divisions sat in interior positions, unable to move because the trains they needed had been destroyed by American pilots flying 50 feet above French farmland at speeds that left no room for error. The doctrinal implications rippled through American military planning for the remainder of the war and beyond. Fighter bombers transitioned from supporting role to primary ground attack weapon. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs carried this mission through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, their pilots attacking every piece of German transportation infrastructure with tactics pioneered during Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo. By war's end, American fighters had destroyed 9,000 locomotives across the European theatre, eliminating German transport capacity and contributing directly to Wehrmacht collapse. The official statistics claimed over 86,000 railroad cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives eliminated, and 6,000 armoured vehicles knocked out between D-Day and VE Day. The numbers told stories of systematic destruction that transformed tactical air power into strategic weapon. But behind every statistic lived human beings who experienced the war from perspectives that official histories rarely captured. German locomotive engineer Franz Weber survived the war despite serving throughout the campaign in France. His memoir, published in 1953, documented the psychological terror of operating trains under continuous air attack. We learned to move only at night, to hide in tunnels during daylight, to abandon locomotives at the first sound of aircraft engines. But there was no safety. The Americans flew missions around the clock. They had unlimited aircraft and pilots who seemed to feel no fear. Every day we lost more locomotives. Every week the situation became more impossible. The French civilians, caught between German occupation and Allied liberation, experienced the campaign as catastrophe that destroyed infrastructure they depended on for survival. Railway sabotage and air attacks eliminated the transportation network that moved food, fuel, and medicine. The calculated cost of liberation included tens of thousands of French casualties from bombing campaigns that couldn't distinguish between German military traffic and civilian necessity. But French resistance leaders who coordinated with Allied operations understood the strategic imperative that demanded destruction of their own infrastructure. Better to endure temporary deprivation than permanent Nazi occupation. The railway workers who sabotaged locomotives and identified targets for Allied fighters made choices that cost French lives, but contributed to liberation that would arrive 6 weeks after D-Day. Captain Sanders returned home in September 1944 after his damaged P-47 was declared beyond economic repair, and he had accumulated enough combat hours to mandate rotation stateside. He spent the remainder of the war training replacement pilots in low-level attack techniques at air bases in Texas and California, teaching young flyers the tactics that had proved their effectiveness over French farmland at costs measured in lives and aircraft. His post-war career included aeronautical engineering work for Republic Aviation, the company that built the Thunderbolt, where he contributed to design improvements based on combat experience. But the missions over France stayed with him in ways that peacetime employment could never erase. The image of locomotives, exploding under 50 caliber fire, the sound of anti-aircraft shells passing close enough to hear, the weight of knowing that tactical decisions made at 300 miles per hour determined whether German divisions reached Normandy or sat stranded in rail yards watching trains that would never arrive. The final assessment of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo's impact required perspective that only became clear years after the war ended. The systematic destruction of German rail capacity in the 2 weeks before D-Day represented one of the most successful applications of air power in military history. Not because it achieved dramatic results in single missions, but because it solved a problem that conventional methods had failed to address. How do you stop an enemy from reinforcing threatened positions when they control interior lines and can move forces by rail faster than attacking armies can advance by sea? The answer American pilots proved involved flying lower than doctrine said was safe, attacking targets conventional wisdom said were too dangerous, and accepting casualties that peacetime training said were unacceptable. Innovation in warfare demanded willingness to challenge every assumption and embrace risk that killed people who trusted the new tactics to work as advertised. The 475 locomotives destroyed between May 21st and June 6th represented more than statistical success. They represented German combat power that never reached Normandy, Allied infantry who survived because enemy reinforcements couldn't arrive, strategic victory achieved through tactical excellence applied at altitudes where one mistake meant death, and one success meant the war moved one step closer to ending. The revolution in aerial warfare that began over French rail lines in May 1944 continued through tactical innovations that transformed how modern militaries conduct ground attack operations. The fundamental lesson endured, beyond World War II, into conflicts that followed. Air superiority means nothing if you can't translate it into effects that matter on the ground. Destroying enemy logistics achieves more than destroying enemy forces if those forces can't fight without supplies. And sometimes, the most effective way to win a war involves flying so low that you can see the faces of people you're about to kill. Captain Sanders died in 1992, having outlived most of his squadron mates and all of his wartime commanders. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his combat record and post-war engineering career without capturing the weight of memory that veterans carried for 50 years after the shooting stopped. The image of French countryside at 50 feet altitude, the sound of Pratt & Whitney R, 2,800 at full power, the knowledge that tactical decisions made in fractions of seconds determined whether locomotives reached their destinations or became scrap metal blocking German supply lines. The locomotives themselves, the Kriegslokomotiven that German industry built by the thousands to supply Hitler's war machine, became monuments to the obsolescence of their own design philosophy. German engineers had created locomotives optimized for European rail networks, capable of moving enormous cargo loads across established infrastructure. But they had never imagined needing to defend those locomotives against fighter aircraft attacking from treetop level at speeds that made interception impossible. By war's end, surviving Kriegslokomotiven spread across Europe as victor nations divided the spoils of German defeat. Some served Eastern European railways for decades. Others rusted in scrapyards as testimony to industrial capacity that couldn't overcome tactical innovation. The few preserved in museums carried stories of a war fought on scales that exceeded human comprehension, but decided by individual actions taken at altitudes measured in feet rather than thousands. The broader lesson of Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo transcended specific tactics or historical context. Military effectiveness derives from willingness to challenge doctrine when doctrine fails to solve operational problems. The American pilots who flew 50 feet above French farmland in May 1944 weren't reckless or suicidal. They were pragmatic professionals who recognized that conventional methods weren't working and innovation demanded accepting risks that peacetime logic would reject. Their success changed how wars are fought, how air power integrates with ground operations, and how military organizations think about the relationship between tactical actions and strategic objectives. The 475 locomotives destroyed in 2 weeks represented more than targets eliminated. They represented proof that determined individuals willing to challenge assumptions could achieve results that conventional wisdom insisted were impossible. And, in the final analysis, that may be the most important lesson that history offers. Not the specific tactics or technologies or battles, but the fundamental truth that innovation requires courage, excellence, demands sacrifice, and winning means being willing to fly lower than anyone thought possible, while carrying the weight of knowledge that success or failure would be measured in thousands of lives, saved or lost on beaches where other people would fight. Battles that logistics determined before the first shot was fired. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.